My name is Mr. McQuire and I welcome you to this presentation which forms part of the Ecology B7 unit and is a biology only lesson. This builds on learning from Key Stage 3 where we look at food chains, about what eats what, and we're going to take that and add vocabulary to it. We have 4 stages to the presentation today. And the first stage will be learning about something called trophic levels and adding that to our food chains understanding. Secondly, we'll be defining biomass. We're going to find out what it is, but we're also going to find out where it goes between levels of a food chain. Thirdly, then we're going to look at a visual tool called a pyramid of biomass, and we're going to learn to construct those accurately before finally we put together our learning of biomass and trophic levels to calculate the efficiency of biomass transfer. So before we start, let's make certain that we've got somewhere quiet to work and that our phones are on silent. You'll need a pen and paper, somewhere secure to write your notes, and during the presentation you may require a calculator as well. If you need to collect those things, just pause the video now. So for our outcomes today, firstly we're going to know the importance of photosynthesis in feeding relationships. Then we're going to construct and interpret trophic level pyramids of biomass from data. Our second outcome today, the Aspire, we're going to learn to calculate efficiency of biomass transfer and explain what losses of biomass are due to. So as a starter, we're going to regather your knowledge from Key Stage 3 Science, and I'd like to start first of all by asking you to select one of the graded questions on the slide in front of you. As you can see, they get a little harder as you move down, but on the right hand side of the page is some help in the form of a diagram just to remind you. So I'd like you to pick the hardest question that you think you could answer in 60 seconds, and on your piece of paper I'd like you to write down the answer to that particular question. Off you go. So on the piece of paper in front of you, you should now have the answer to one of those questions. If you don't have the answer, then be prepared on the next slide to stop the computer and to look and write down and rehearse the particular stuff that comes up shortly. So photosynthesis, this is point 1, and the learning from biology all flows from this point. Virtually all organisms are dependent on energy from the sun. Plants harness light energy to drive food production. So we're going to look at the word equation first. And again, I'll state, if you don't know this particular equation, it's vital before we move further into the lesson that we get this sorted. Carbon dioxide from the air is a mixture with water from the soil through the roots. Those two particular molecules are disassembled using light energy, and then using a molecule in the plant called chlorophyll, they're reassembled into high energy glucose and oxygen. Higher level question then, we have a symbol equation but for those of you who have higher level knowledge, you'll know that that doesn't balance, but it's exactly the same as the word equation. It both just translated, but then to balance it, we just add 6's across, and that's a great way of learning it. So if you need to stop the video to write those down and rehearse them, now is a very good time to do that. So on the slide in front of you, we have a food chain that we would use with a year 7 or 8 student. And to translate that, it says that the grass is eaten by a grasshopper, etc. So the arrow means eaten by. Now there are 5 sentences, and each of those sentences has some science in it. 4 of them are correct and 1 of them is a lie. So I'd like you to spend 60 seconds looking through each of those sentences and see if you can pick out which one is a lie. Okay, so hopefully you've written down a number so that you can't change your mind now. Now, first of all, sentence number 5, let's just remove that from the possibility of being a lie. It's a basic statement about today's lesson. Each level in a food chain is called a trophic level. That is correct. Now, sentence number 1, all of the energy that flows through food chains comes originally from the sun. And intrinsically for key stage 4, that is a correct statement, so let's remove that. Number 2, food chains show which organisms eat other organisms, and again, that is a basic correct sentence. But now we have more detail with sentence 3 and sentence 4, which are referring to the arrows. So the arrows in food chains show what each organism eats. Sentence 3 I've just read. Now, if that arrow, sentence is correct, then the mouse is eating the owl, and that cannot possibly be correct. Whereas on sentence 4, the arrow in a food chain shows the flow of energy through the system, which is correct. So sentence 3 is the incorrect sentence. So in our first learning outcome, the challenge at the top of the page there, it says that we should know the importance of photosynthesis in feeding relationships. So we should now have the equation secure in our mind, and we should know that the first stage of a food chain will be a plant, which uses photosynthesis to gain energy using sunlight. Now, the key words on the slide in front of you are now a pivotal point in this presentation, and we need to be clear about them. We have some words that you should recognize in front of you, such as herbivore and carnivore. There are some other words here that perhaps you recognize and understand already, such as omnivore, but we need to make sure now that your learning and your notes reflects these words so that we can use them later in the lesson. So we're going to rehearse and practice the definitions for each of these words. So on the right hand side of the page we have the keywords from the previous slide, and now on the left hand side of the page we have the definitions. I've given each of those definitions a number from 1 to 8. On the right hand side I've given each of those keywords a letter from A to H. So I'd now like you to spend a couple of minutes associating a number from 1 to 8, which I'd like you to put on your page in front of you. So writing the numbers down the page from 1 to 8. Next to each of those numbers, I would like you to write the letter of the keyword that definition applies to. Let's just have an example. So definition number 1, organisms which can make their food using sunlight, plants and algae. The answer to that would be F, which is the word producer. So I'd like you to do the others now. You've got 2 minutes to do that in. Away you go. One minute remaining. Okay, that's 2 minutes. Now ten seconds remaining. Okay, let's have a look at what you've written down then. I've resorted the second column now. So we've got number 1 as F, number 2 as E, number 3 is D, number 4 is H, and number 5 is G, 6 is A, 7 an animal that feeds on other animals is a carnivore, B, and number 8 is E. Now you should know a lot of those words, 1 or 2 like apex predator that may be new to you, but from maths, for example, we should be familiar with top or apex. Omnivore maybe is a new word to you as well. Now we've got some information to add to this before we include the whole of this table in our notes as the most important thing that we covered today. The information that I want to add is this column here on trophic level. So we're adding to the vocabulary, and I need to be clear about how this information may be used in an exam. They could draw a food chain and they could say to you, put an example down of a level 1 organism. And you would have to know that level 1 applied to producers or plants that make their own food using sunlight. So you'd be looking for a plant. You'll notice that the levels stop at level 4. So once we reach a tertiary consumer, at that point then we stop going higher than that. And that really reflects something that we're going to cover later in the this particular lesson. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take the information that's in front of us and we're going to spend a good few minutes reproducing it now. It needs to be done really carefully. You'll notice the third column is quite narrow, so it doesn't need a great deal of room. The definitions I really can't shorten very much, but obviously now we don't need a number and we don't need a letter, allowing us to reduce those as well. So on your piece of paper in front of you, if you could now spend a good 5 minutes, I think, reproducing that table. Please be careful, make sure that you're staying focused while you're busy writing this out so that we learn some words as we go. If you wish to swap the name column and the definition column over so that they're slightly more logical, that would be great, but just make sure that you keep your work as accurate as possible. So 5 minutes starting from now. Just coming up to 3 minutes. Just a reminder that we are reproducing the table in front of you, including the trophic level column. Just be very careful about the positioning of each of those rows as we go through this. "30 seconds remaining." Okay, so moving on swiftly, we now take the information that's in the table in front of you and we get to develop that information very, very clearly. This is an exercise where I don't particularly need you to write anything, but I want you to just concentrate as we go through these, and we'll work through this together if that's okay. So the yellow box is the easy part. This is the definition word. The right hand box, the blue box, is new words that we've just learnt to do with the idea of trophic level. So we're going to start with the left hand box. Now, grass, as we know, is a plant that produces its energy from the use of photosynthesis. So that being the case, I am going to say that that word that goes with that level is producer. If you look at the second one, I'm not going to wait with enthusiasm for you to think now. Just think about what word you would use from the table to describe the grasshopper. Okay, so my thinking goes that it's a grasshopper is a herbivore. It is eating a plant, so it's no longer a producer, it is now a consumer. And because it's the first consumer in this particular food chain, I'm going to call it a primary consumer. So moving quicker now, that means that the mouse is a secondary consumer, and that means that the owl at the top is a tertiary or third level consumer. And by the way, the university college sector in the United Kingdom is called the tertiary sector. We use the word primary and secondary school very often, but we don't refer to and need to refer to the word tertiary very often. Okay, that bit's straightforward. So let's look at those and just confirm those. Now, on the right hand side of the page, I'd now like you to spend a minute just applying those words to the tertiary level, this new phrase that we have. Okay, so if you can now just concentrate for a second, look at the table that you've reproduced. which tertiary level do each of those organisms belong? You've got 1 minute to think about that. Off you go. Okay, so we've got 10 seconds remaining. Just finishing off. Remember, what trophic level do each of those organisms belong? So we're learning to apply information. Okay, let's have a look at those. So, grass is the first trophic level. Second is the grasshopper. And you can see the mouse is the third trophic level and the owl is the fourth trophic level. And remembering, if we had something that was a predator for the owl, then in the context of this food chain, that would also be a fourth trophic level. So it's important to remember that doesn't go higher. Okay, let's move on. Now, on your piece of paper, if you could put the title of what is biomass, and then underneath that, if you can write down this definition of biomass that's coming once we've taken the word to bits. Bio meaning living, and mass is the amount of living matter within it. Then we end up with this definition. Biomass is the total quantity or weight of living tissue in an organism. So if you can please put down the title, what is biomass, and then underneath that, put it in a bubble, put it in a box, make it highlighted, that definition that's there. Off you go. Okay, so we're now going to take this idea of biomass with your underlying title and your definition, and we're going to look at how we would use that within biology. We're going to look at something called a pyramid of biomass, which is part of the challenge, the first learning outcome of our lesson. So we're going to learn to construct and interpret a pyramid of biomass using trophic levels, which are this new word that we've learnt. So here effectively is a food chain. We've got 500 kilograms of leaves, which are eaten by a caterpillar, which is eaten by a blue tit, which is eaten by a sparrowhawk. And now in this instance, somebody has gone and they have literally, with a mass balance, found the mass of each level of that particular food chain, each trophic level. Now, we're going to just practice for a second because this is not complicated. We have got one square on this particular piece of graph paper signifying 5 kilograms. we have to draw a box as the first trophic level to represent 500 kilograms of leaves. So 500 divided by 5 gives us 100 squares, and on that 100 square box we would write leaves, and that would represent the first stage. How many leaves, or how many boxes I should say, would we then use for the caterpillars, because we have to work out each one. So it's going to be 50 kilograms of caterpillars divided by 5 kilograms per box, which is going to take us 10 boxes to represent that. Blue tits is easy, it's going to be just one box, but you'll notice that we've changed it slightly when I put that picture in. And then finally we have this very small box, 0.5 divided by 5 kilograms for the sparrowhawk at the top. So let's look at what that would look like if we spent some time drawing it. So as I've said, 100 squares at the bottom, 10 squares, 1 square, and then we have this very, very narrow line that I've drawn slightly to one side so we can see it at the top, that represents well, basically 1/10 of a square. So you'll notice how I've constructed it. I've lined it up so that we end up with as much of a pyramid shape, because this is a pyramid of biomass. Now you'll notice that between each of the trophic levels in this particular pyramid of biomass, there is a loss of energy, of mass. And as that mass is lost, it begins to very quickly dawn on us that that mass loss is something we need to understand. We need to know where that particular mass is going. So we're going to now spend some time looking at the loss of mass, which is part of our Aspire learning outcome from the lesson. We're going to explain those losses, then we're going to calculate the efficiency. So we saw on the previous slide that mass is lost as we move up a pyramid of biomass. As we move along a food chain, mass is lost. We now need to think about why it is. This is one of those topic areas where it's very easy to remember a couple of very good examples, but I'd like you to have deeper knowledge as biology triple science students so that we could write a more complicated answer. I'd like to spend a couple of minutes thinking about why mass could be lost between, for example, the leaves and the caterpillars, and then the caterpillars and the blue tits. What's happening between each of those levels that means that not all of the mass that's inside the leaves ends up in the caterpillars. Make a list on the page in front of you so that we can start adding to that as I run through that with you in a couple of minutes. So you've got 2 minutes to do that, starting now. Off you go. Okay, just to remind you, we've got 30 seconds now, and we're writing a list of where mass could be lost between stages of a food chain. So we've got 20 seconds now until the end. Okay, let's look at what you've written. So why is biomass lost at each stage? And answers, this is an exclusive list, by the way. Not all organisms are eaten at the stage above. And now what's meant by that, for example, is that not all of the leaves will be eaten by the caterpillars. Some of the leaves, of course, will just fall on the ground and decay. So they're lost from that particular food chain. Second bullet point, once eaten, some material is passed out as waste product, so not all energy is absorbed. Please bear in mind that parts of every organism are not digestible. Yeah, I have in my mind a picture of a gazelle, for example, that's been killed by lions. The skeleton just sits there, but that is part of its biomass. Same thing applies to the leaves. Please try and avoid vaguely rude answers. They will not get you marked with words like poo. We are trying very hard to make sure we're writing in proper terminology. Third bullet point, energy is used for respiration. My best answer for an organism where it is used for living processes such as movement, reproduction, nutrition, in other words, finding food. So all of those will result in a loss of biomass between each stage of a food chain. If you need to add to your answers, then please shorten some of those points and put them on there, but just be clear about why mass is lost at each stage. I'd like you to pause the video, take as much time as you need to record some information to answer that particular question while I move on. Okay, so you should have made some notes, and those notes now will help you answer the following question. If you didn't make some notes from the previous slide, please rewind and look again and make sure that you do that so that you're not moving backwards and forwards in this presentation. So here's a question I'd like you to write down. It's worth 4 marks and could easily be a full 6-mark question. Explain why most food chains are rarely more than 3 or 4 stages long. So this takes the information that we've just learned and it now applies it with a bit of thought as to why it is that movement of energy and mass cannot mean that we have endless food chains in length. So what must be happening between each of the stages to mean that we can only have them 3 or 4 stages long? It's the odd 5 that I can think of, but they're very, very rare. So you've written the question down. You have got 2 minutes to write down 4 bullet points or to write in general open prose to explain why they're rarely more than 3 or 4 stages long. What happens to prevent them being longer? 2 minutes. Okay, you've got 30 seconds remaining. If you haven't got something beginning with the R word down there, don't forget to add that, the science R word. Okay, let's look at a mark scheme. So, point number 1, food chains are rarely more than 3 or 4 stages long because each stage of the food chain energy is lost. Okay, second bullet point. Energy is released or lost through respiration and used for movement and keeping warm. Number 2, a lot of energy is also lost through waste such as feces, skeletons, fur. Any of those will do as a relevant point. And lastly, only a small amount of energy used for growth and putting on biomass. So most energy that an organism eats is wasted in life processes. We do not put on hardly a fraction of that energy in actual growth in terms of biomass. So we're incredibly wasteful as organisms. Now, I'd like you to look through your answers to that particular question. Just make 1 or 2 points if you need to. Again, I'd like you to pause the presentation if you need some time to do that, but I'm going to give you just 30 seconds just to tidy up your answer to that question for good revision notes. Off you go. Okay, so we're going to work through this entire slide together, and then I'll give you a couple of minutes to write down the information. How do you calculate efficiency is the title that we'll put at the top of those notes. So we need an equation to allow us to do that. Efficiency is the energy used for growth. Please note it's energy for growth, not energy that's wasted in the other things that we've just learnt about, divided by the total energy that's supplied. So this efficiency equation is no different really from something we would use in physics to calculate the efficiency of a torch, for example, or in chemistry, the efficiency of some kind of production process. Let's have an example in biology though. Remember, I'm going to give you 2 minutes to write this out. So here's an example. If grass receives 1 million kilojoules of energy, so that is our energy supplied from the sun, and uses just 20,000 kilojoules of that million for growth, then we can put that information into an equation like that. And if we do the math, then we end up with an answer of 0.02 multiplied by 100 to make it just 2%. Okay, so I'd like you to again just apply this to your notes, because this is very simple skill, but requires us to learn it and just have it in our notes for later for revision. So I'll give you 2 minutes now to write down the information that's on the slide in front of you. Okay, so if you need to pause this presentation to finish the last slide, please just go back a few seconds. So in this presentation today, we've looked at photosynthesis in feeding relationships. We've learnt some new words to do with trophic levels. We have constructed pyramids of biomass and found out where that biomass disappears to during the course of feeding relationships. And then we've done a bit of maths at the end there, where we have learnt to calculate the efficiency of the movement of biomass between different levels. These next few pages are just notes from the lesson, so if you have completed your notes effectively, then this will be very quick. I'm not going to time the next few pages. All I'm going to do is leave them up for 10 seconds so that people have time to pause them before I move on to the next one. If you need to go back through the lesson, then you can scan through the lesson very quickly to find that particular page again. So this is the first slide that we looked at today with this presentation. We had the definitions, we practiced the name to go with those definitions, and we added this new idea of trophic level to those definitions. If you need to get those down neatly in your notes, pause this now before I move on. We then looked at the idea of what biomass was, but we then questioned why it was that biomass is lost in each stage. And the one that I want to point out to you as the answer to really nail is that living organisms respire, using up some of that biomass, which is lost to the surroundings as thermal energy. Again, if you need to record those in your notes, then just pause it now. Just check that your notes are complete. And by this stage, most of the keywords at the bottom of the screen have already been dealt with. So just have a look through those and make sure that we're clear about some of those keywords that are there. We then did a little bit of practice. And we learnt to construct a pyramid of biomass. Now you have nothing of this in your notes at the moment. The biggest skill that there is in this is actually working out how many squares there are to each of the trophic levels. And you can see there's a very straightforward bit of maths, but it's important that you look at the key before you start constructing this. I could have changed the shape slightly, just in case you're wondering, does it have to be specifically this shape? The answer is, if that green box is 100 squares and you decide to make it a little bit taller and a bit narrower, then that's fine. That's no pattern that I have particularly chosen. If you need to sketch that out and just make yourself some notes, then that's fine. Notice on the left, that's a food chain, isn't it? From leaves to caterpillars to blue tits. Again, if you need to pause it, then do so at this point. And then the final slide that we've just looked at together. Notice this is a percentage calculation, so I could have added times 100 to the equation that's there. So in summary, the challenge and the aspire, the learning outcomes up the top of the page, I think that we've covered those together today. And we've used all of the keywords down at the bottom of the page. Just check those through, and thank you for staying with me through this lesson today.